tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by an award-winning historian, author, and sociologist who's devoted his life to studying the founding fathers of our nation and the ideals that this country is built on. His book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, is perhaps one of the best books I've ever read on the founding era of this nation. Currently, he's the director for the Center for History and Social Change at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Professor Harvey Kaye now joins me. Professor, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Great to have you with us. What led you into history as your life work, and what led you to Thomas Paine?
My grandfather, who lived in Brooklyn, New York, and was a trial lawyer in New York City, had a library of books at home, and whenever I was at my grandparents' apartment, I would somehow end up there. And so when I was about 10 years of age, I remember sitting in the back of the dining room just pulling books off the shelves, and there was one book that stood out, a book by a man named Joseph Lewis, who was a famous atheist of the day who was promoting Thomas Paine's memory. And in this book, which was wrong, and you as a Jefferson scholar will appreciate this, he made the argument that Thomas Paine was the real author of the Declaration. Now, the argument was wrong, but for a 10-year-old, it was an exciting thought to be able to show a teacher in school that they were wrong, that it was, you know, so it was that kind of thing. So it really, in many ways, it's sort of accidental, serendipitous. Yeah. But since my grandfather had this fascination for Paine, and my grandfather was great with ideas and great with arguments, I somehow just got imbued with this idea that Paine was my hero too. So when I was in high school, and I can't say I understood all of it, I would read whatever I could by Thomas Paine, from Rights of Man and Common Sense to The Age of Reason. And I actually did not start out as an American historian. I worked on Latin American studies and on European studies. But in the 1990s, already feeling, you know, I mean, anyone coming out of the 60s interested in history generally came out as a progressive. In the early 90s, I had pretty much determined that the only way to make a really major difference was to become an Americanist. And I did so by way of laying claim or reclaiming my attachment to Thomas Paine. So Paine became my entree to the American radical tradition, the American progressive tradition, and to trying to better understand not just American history, but why there still persists in American imagination a kind of radical impulse.
Paine played a very pivotal role in the revolution, in inciting the revolution and funding the revolution. Can you talk a little bit about that and who Thomas Paine was?
Oh, I'd be happy to. Paine was born in England in 1737. And he didn't come to the United States, or to America, it wasn't the United States yet, until very late 1774. And he came with a very checkered record, not so much politically, but a checkered record in terms of his business dealings, in terms of his career in the British Excise Commission. He had been sacked from the British Excise Commission for helping to organize demands, an early form of labor organizing, demanding from Parliament a raise for the excise officers. And it was in England, in London, where he had met Ben Franklin, and Franklin urged him, given his circumstances, to head to America. Opportunities might exist there. We don't know if Franklin had revolutionary possibilities in mind for Paine or not. But when Paine came to America, he was just astounded and amazed at the energy, the rambunctiousness, the enthusiasm that Americans had to demand their rights as Britishers, as Englishmen. And he was particularly impressed by the fact that they were organizing themselves into committees, that in essence they showed that they didn't need a foreign power ruling them. They didn't need anyone ruling them, that they could rule themselves. So in the course of that year, to make the long story short, he ends up committing himself to writing a pamphlet that comes out as Common Sense in January of 1776, in which he's trying to tell Americans, look, you have the opportunity of creating an unprecedented kind of political nation, a democratic republic. And moreover, you should be thinking not in terms of claiming your rights as Brits, as Englishmen, but your rights as human beings. In other words, not even just saying these are rights that Americans alone would have. He had in mind a vision of Americans setting an example to the world in favor of universal rights of man and of woman. So he was astounded by what he saw, inspired by what he saw, and he then takes his pen to paper and ends up writing a pamphlet of world historic importance, because within 6 months or so, of course, towns and cities across the country are passing resolutions in favor of separation, of declaring America's independence. The Continental Congress finally gets the courage to create a committee commissioning Jefferson to write the Declaration, and indeed, July 4th is the consequence of that.
And this pamphlet is these are the times that try men
no, that
was the crisis.
That's the crisis.
So common sense precedes the crisis.
So common sense precedes the crisis. It's the pamphlet in which he says the cause of America is the cause of all mankind, in the sense of we can set an example to the world. And then there's a line very late in the pamphlet which he writes, which of all people Ronald Reagan picks up on. And that's the line, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And what Paine means is that we indeed can create a world historic revolution. Now, Paine himself joined the American military. He joins a militia out of Philadelphia and heads off to New York. The militia itself goes back to Philadelphia before the battles ensue. Paine ends up in the camp of Nathanael Greene and ends up in Washington's camp itself. Washington is already infatuated with Paine's pen, and there, knowing they're about to do this terrible retreat across New Jersey to the Delaware, is where Washington says to Paine, it's time for you to take up your pen again. And he begins somewhere around Newark, New Jersey, to write "These are the times that try men's souls," the first of the great crisis papers. And that's probably the line, I think it may well be the most quoted line in American history, because it's not only a line that politicians have cited and statesmen have recited, but also how many times at halftime as a football coach trying to rally his boys or his girls said, "These are the times that try men's souls."
Sunshine Soldier.
And then, of course, Sunshine Soldiers, which, of course, resonates through American history. And to American history. And to this day, in the protest against the war in Vietnam, the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War became known as the Winter Soldiers, which was, of course, a link back to Thomas Paine.
Right, the opposite of the the soldiers.
The opposite of the summer soldiers.
Committed soldiers.
Right.
The American radical slash I'm reluctant to use the word radical because there's been a right-wing radical movement in the United States as well, and I would say in modern days probably from William F. Buckley forward, arguably the conservative mind in '52 was a starting point for that. But
can I just say, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I've been thinking about writing a piece, and I'm not even sure if I'm original on this. I have this feeling other people are thinking the same thing, saying we've lost touch with a very valuable word, reactionary, because it's time we started to call many of these conservatives not conservatives, but reactionaries. Right. Conservatives is an honorable tradition. A reactionary tradition is what we have to be especially wary of.
And they are not radicals, they're reactionaries.
Right, and they are not radicals. Radicals were on the left.
Okay, so Russell Kirk to William F. Buckley to now Michelle Bachmann.
Well, yeah,
there is an arc there.
There is an arc.
As bizarre as it sounds.
Right.
Yeah, but on the progressive side, there's actually a tradition that arguably goes back to the Enlightenment, that arc goes through thinkers like Jefferson, and Paine was a piece of that. Can you talk about that progressive tradition and Paine's role in it, and now to today?
Right. One of the things that was assumed by historians right from the beginning, you might say, is that Paine had been forgotten, that somehow conservatives of their day and reactionaries of their day, or what I like to call the powerful, the property, the prestigious, the pious, all these folks really did try to suppress Paine's memory. And all of us had generally accepted that they had succeeded in doing so, and that those of us who were going to work on Paine were going to somehow recover Paine from that, abyss. But in fact, in every generation of American progressives, the free thinkers, the abolitionists, the women's rights advocates, the working men's organizers, the populists, the progressives, the socialists, all the way through. In every generation, when they wanted to speak to their fellow Americans, what they did is they reached back to the Revolution to lay claim to that tradition, and there they discovered Paine's writings. And thus, in every generation, all the way through, until the most recent, I have to say, progressives have laid claim to Paine, and then in essence laid claim to the Revolution, and challenged not only conservatives but challenged liberals to be all the more liberal And I think that, by the way, is what I think we've been losing. And in fact, that's why we often hear conservatives, ever since Reagan, trying to lay claim to Paine.
Well, and in fact, Glenn Beck most recently wrote a book called Common Sense. I mean, this to me seemed like, you know, the old Superman Bizarro world. You know, I mean, we've stepped through the looking glass.
Right.
Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the Glenn Beck thing is a remark. I mean, Reagan himself laid claim to Thomas Paine. And I often have asked myself, how did that happen? And I even wonder if it doesn't sort of link directly to his original affection for Franklin Roosevelt, because Roosevelt quoted Thomas Paine at key moments to the American people. And Reagan was, of course, originally a Roosevelt New Deal Democrat. And so here's Reagan in the late 70s running for president, and in essence it's as if the memory comes back to him. Here's his way of both laying claim to a rhetorical tradition of Roosevelt, but it's also a way, can you imagine, I got this notion that he said, I'm going to make those lefties upset. In other words, it's not only a matter of inspiring your troops, it's a matter of antagonizing your antagonists. And I think, in essence, that we have to look quite often at how right-wing celebrity figures have grabbed hold of Paine and tried to turn it, not only towards their own political ends. I mean, Glenn Beck utterly perverts everything Paine would have said in his, when Glenn Beck has Glenn Beck's Common Sense, you know, his channeling, you might say, of Thomas Paine. But in fact, I get this feeling that it's not only he's trying to lay claim to this kind of American rambunctiousness, but he's also at the very same time saying, he's smacking the left. He's saying enough of that.
I mean, I felt that this was just a slap in the face.
And Sarah Palin, in her new book, her epigram is the word, or epigraph? The epigraph is a quotation from Thomas Paine. I remember when I looked at it, I said to my wife, uh-oh. You know that line, she had me at the word go or something like that? I thought, uh-oh, you know, and then I realized what we're talking about here is this effort by the right, the reactionary right, to lay claim to that radical tradition, and more dangerously, that we progressives too often, maybe not everyone, but too often progressives have lost touch with that.
And Palin had a very, very competent ghostwriter in that second book. The ability or the need or the technique for the left to lay claim to Paine's progressive tradition, how should that be done? Well,
the first thing to understand is I think too many people, liberals, progressives, don't feel confident about their fellow citizens. I think that there's this idea that they may feel confident about what American history might afford, but there's real reservations about their fellow citizens. I think they allow the energy of the Tea Party to lead them to believe that most Americans are somehow following some lead afforded by the likes of Beck and Palin or Rick Perry down in Texas. And they fail to consider that most Americans have been eager. I'm not saying this to try and impress anyone. I really do believe that Thomas Paine and radicals after him, but Paine in particular, imbued American life with a radical democratic impulse, and that radical democratic impulse survives. I actually believe that the best proof of that, I have two things that I can refer to. One, most recently, is think of the energy on the day of the Obama inauguration, when 2 million people turned out here in Washington on the Mall, and you could and I tried to imagine what it would be like, not from the vantage point of the 2 million looking up towards the Capitol, but from Obama looking out at the 2 million. And thinking, and if he had read it, you know, people can sort of read and read at the same time, and he could look at it and he'd say, 2 million people, from 5 years of age probably to 85 years of age, as diverse as can be. And there amongst the monument to Washington, the Revolutionary General, with Lincoln Memorial off in the distance, and to imagine all the progressives who stood on those steps, Glenn Beck aside, all of those progressives who stood on those steps to speak of civil rights, Marian Anderson to sing God Bless America, or if I'm mistaken, some song like that, and then to think off to the Jefferson Memorial, the FDR Memorial. I mean, American history stares one in the face. And it isn't just these memorials to these dead folk. It's these memorials that are surrounded by 2 million Americans ready to say, it's time to change America. Now, we can leave another question as to whether or not that was pursued properly. But the moment was there, and that was that impulse that once again had been waiting for its time. Because you could look back at previous presidential campaigns and say, well, liberals ran, but they were afraid to mobilize their fellow citizens. And at the point on that day of the inauguration, Americans were mobilizing themselves and not waiting for orders. They were waiting for a sense of direction.
Brilliantly said. More with Professor Harvey Kaye when we come right back.